Colt Mercer had ridden across many miles of hard country, but nothing tightened his chest like the quiet voice that rose from the canyon's shadows. "Cowboy, you're on sacred land." The Apache elder, Nayland, stood still as stone, eyes ancient, unblinking, carrying the weight of generations. For a heartbeat, the wind itself seemed to hesitate. Colt's hand drifted away from his holster, not from fear, but from respect. "I meant no harm," he replied softly, unaware that those 4 words would pull him into a mystery older than the trail beneath his boots, and far more dangerous. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. Colt Mercer felt the canyon hold its breath as he faced Nayland, the Apache elder whose voice carried like stone thrown into a still pool. "Cowboy, you're on sacred land," the elder said, and those words landed heavier than any bullet could, folding the light into a quiet that made the wind seem ashamed to move. Colt's boots found no hurry to leave, though every instinct he learned on hard trails urged him to mount and push away from trouble. Because this was not the kind of trouble marked by law or blood but by something older, an expectancy in the air that prickled along his neck and reached into his ribs. And when he looked at Nayland, he did not see accusation so much as disappointment, a patient, immense sorrow that made Colt's chest ache as if the canyon itself had wrapped its fingers around his heart and asked for explanation. And for a long moment Colt could only recall the paths that led him here, a split fence, a burned letter, the echo of a promise not kept, and in that recall there lived a shame so familiar it felt like company, a heavy companion he had carried beneath his coat for years. Nayland stood like a cairn of years, skin knotted by sun and wind, eyes that had watched seasons like people. And when the elder's voice softened, it drew from Colt something he rarely offered, a confession in the shape of stillness, a readiness to listen rather than to judge or to draw. The canyon answered with a low humming, the kind of sound one hears when a river remembers its original course. And Nayland's disappointment was not theatrical but elemental, as if the land itself were asking why a man who had seen so much had not yet learned the art of gentleness. Colt's hand drifted away from his holster, not in fear but out of respect, and he let his fingers rest against the pommel as if touching an old, tarnished truth. And in that touch he felt both the weight of his past and the possibility of some small redemption. Nayland asked, simply and without hurry, why Colt traveled alone with a heavy heart. The elder's words folded with a knowledge no stranger should possess, names murmured in ways Colt had not spoken aloud, a mention of a burned homestead, a lost brother's laughter swallowed by drought, and with each revelation Colt felt the map of his life redraw itself, like shadow shifting to reveal a hidden path. He realized then, in a way that felt like being struck by sun, that this meeting was not an accident of trail and timing but a deliberate crossing, the canyon having chosen to intersect with him for reasons beyond the ledger of men. There was no sermon in Nayland's manner, only the patient presenting of facts shaped like questions, and as Colt answered, voice low, words pared down to what mattered, he found his history revealed by action and by omission rather than by boasting or lies, and the narration of his guilt unwound not as a catalogue of sins but as the brittle, honest thread of a man seeking purchase. The air tightened with promise and threat, for an elder who speaks of sicker places does not speak lightly, and Colt knew that to stay would mean stepping into a story that demanded more than courage. It demanded listening, a kind of bravery he had never been taught at the bar or on the range. So he stayed, because in the elder's eyes he saw the reflection of a life he could still choose, hard, redeemed, full of small, exacting kindnesses. And in that quiet understanding the canyon intoned and let him in, not as a trespasser but as someone who might yet learn to honor what he had once trampled. Colt followed Nayland along a narrow, shaded shelf of the canyon where sunlight came in thin, steady ribbons and the earth smelled of dust, pine, and the faint ghost of rain, and with every careful step the trail stitched open a map of the road behind him. He saw the Mercer ranch as if it lay before his eyes, the crooked porch where his mother once set a chipped cup of coffee for him before dawn, the lean corrals where horses stamped like restless questions, the long summer when the river ran low and promises ran out faster, The night the ledger was closed on his family's name and a neighbor's greed turned a set of kin into enemies with words sharp as barbed wire, memory carried small, human details that hurt hardest. The laugh of a sister who loved to find a better life. The way his father's jaw tightened when words about pride and survival were spoken. The scent of cedar that used to mean safety until it meant a note nailed to a gate. And these images rose like the canyon's own layers, sediment of regret piling in Colt's chest until guilt lay on him like the dust on his coat, heavy and familiar, impossible to brush away. He hadn't come here to be judged by Nayland. He had come to write and perhaps to forget. But walking beside the elder, he felt his armor crack, felt the old defenses of glib jokes and a steady hand peel back to reveal a man who had fled more than a town. He had fled himself, a man taught to measure worth by cattle and lore rather than by the quiet work of mending what one had broken. Yet the softer parts of him, loyalty that clung like burrs to his shirt sleeve, the habit of returning for a lost dog, the secret of sending a portion of coin to a sister's distant address, surfaced in the hush between two horses' breaths, and the narration of his life shifted from accusation to confession in small, on a door and axe, not in brash declarations. Nayland walked with the patience of someone who had watched seasons trade places without hurry, and he listened without judgment, his eyes like withered maps that had learned to read the fold of a man's soul by the way his shoulders carried their load. And when Colt tried to explain the tangle of debt, pride, and fear that had driven him away from the only home he'd known, Nayland did not offer condemnation but a steady sort of attention that opened a space where Colt could be honest without theatrics, where the canyon allowed the truth to be plain and not dressed up for defense. The elder's lack of surprise at Colt's past surprised him, for Nayland spoke of human failings as if they were stones in a riverbed, things one might trip over but could, with care, learn to step around. So Colt found himself narrating less to defend and more to unburden. The broken promise he'd never had the courage to fix, the feud that had turned neighbors into strangers, the nights he dreamed of walking back through the Mercer gate and finding it whole again. And each confession loosened something in him, a small, internal shift from hardened outlaw to a man recognizing the shape of responsibility. The canyon itself seemed to approve of this slow confession, wind moving through juniper like a deliberate exhale. And where once Colt's path had been only escape, it began to look like approach toward repair, toward a humility Nayland embodied without sermon, toward the possibility of returning not as a defeated son but as a man who would try to set right what his silence had allowed to rot. And by the time they reached the cliffside where shadow met open sky, Colt's guilt was still with him but no longer the only companion. He carried also a small, new resolve, tempered by the elder's quiet recognition that running from the law is easier than facing the small reckonings a life demands. And in that recognition Colt discovered the first, fragile outlines of a purpose he had long tried to avoid. Nayland spoke with the patience of rock and rain, his voice low and shaped by years of listening rather than telling. And he told Colt how the canyon had been restless, small things first, the kind of shifts a man could dismiss until they braided together into a pattern. The jackrabbits that ran blind in the moonlight, the hawks that circled too low and then rose with a sound like a held breath, the creek that changed its murmuring in the night as if remembering another route, the campfires that refused to burn clean and smoked like regret, and the old pines that shed needles in a way that made the ground look as if it wore winter even in summer. Nayland spoke of dreams carried like loose stones from mouth to mouth, dreams of a shadowed wagon, of hollowed faces in a gallery of rock, of a woman's song that turned to a warning. And when he described the lands on East, Colt felt an odd reverence and a prickling at the base of his skull because the world Nayland described was not the world you could mark on a surveyor's chart. It was older, a ledger kept by wind and root, and Nayland said, plainly, that the land had chosen Colt, a declaration that made Colt's muscles twist as if someone had wrung his shoulders, because Colt was a man of tact and rail, not one accustomed to being chosen by something that did not wear a hat. And yet when he listened there was a sense of charged air, as if the canyon held a charge like a lantern left on a porch in a storm, to a lifetime of measuring worth by hands and accounts. This idea felt absurd and invasive and, somehow, quietly insistent, the kind of insistence that did not beg but commanded attention. Nayland did not elaborate like a preacher. He offered images, an arrowhead found where no one had hunted in years, the scent of a fire put out by no human hand, a track too new for the river to have carved, And in those images Colt recognized the shape of trespass, not mere passage but an entry with intent, and the elder's face shadowed with a seriousness that pinned him more thoroughly than any sheriff's badge. Then Nayland dropped the name of a kind of danger Colt understood without needing to know the particulars. Someone had come before, not a drifter with empty pockets but a man who hunted what belonged to others for coin and for sport, a relic taker who traded sacred pieces like trinkets in market towns. And the elder named no one directly but described hands that had the habit of taking what did not belong to them, hands that left a taste in the mouth like iron, hands that had met resistance before and had learned how to ignore it. Colt's chest tightened because, in the long, private ledger of his life, there were moments where he had turned away from cruelty rather than face it, and the thought that some other man had come through this canyon before him, bellied with greed or worse, set the trail behind his ribs aflame with memory and a new, uninvited responsibility. Nayland's eyes held no triumph when he said the land had chosen him but rather a kind of tender demand, as if the canyon were asking for a steward rather than a conqueror. And Colt, who had ridden at the edges of towns and laws and had learned to live with the knowledge that many things were not his to fix, felt something shift inside him like a hidden hinge opening. The elder's words braided with the canyon's own modest protests to form an urgent shape. A person had trespassed with purpose, and what they sought was not merely a curiosity but a thing bound to memory and to pain, a thing that, if removed or disturbed, could harm more than the body. It could unbalance the story the land told about itself. Colt's first impulse, trained by years on the range, was to make plans, to track and confront and settle accounts. But Nayland's calmness taught him another movement, one that required listening, patience, and the stubborn mercy of a man willing to stand with an elder and let the canyon decide what justice looked like. And so, standing beneath a sky the color of old din, Colt felt the old defenses he used to carry like armor loosen. And for the first time in a long while he entertained the thought that to be chosen might mean an obligation to repair rather than to possess, a responsibility heavier than any saddle but one that might redeem the quieter parts of him if he had the courage to follow where the land itself pointed. Colt crouched and let the canyon's dust speak to him, eyes narrowing at the tracks that read like a blood, honest letter. Heavy boot prints pressed deep where the soil was soft, a smear where a boot had slipped. A broken branch snapped clean as if by a nervous hand, and a dark smudge of gun oil on a stone that smelled like a confession. All of it laid out in plain English beneath the unblinking sun. He traced the line with his gaze and felt the old, practical part of him. Tracker, cowboy, man who could read a horse's mood from a tail twitch. Wake up, cataloging size, weight, and haste. While Nayland watched him with the soft severity of one who has seen too many footsteps marred paths not meant for them, and when Colt told him what he saw the elder nodded as if each detail was not new but part of a pattern he had been watching for years. And then Nayland spoke in his slow, steady way about what had been taken. An artifact bound to a people's memory, carved and consecrated and stolen in a night that left a hollow beside a hearth. Something that carried more than wood and bone inside it. Stories, song, a kind of moral weight. And the elder's words fell heavy because they tied the tracks to a purpose beyond curiosity or wealth. This was not a trinket for a curiosity cabinet, but a thing whose absence unstitched an old fabric and whose removal could set small, dangerous things in motion. And Nayland said the man who had been through here before was not careless or sentimental but precise, a relic taker schooled in taking what others guarded with prayer and patience, a hand that had learned how to ignore warnings and how to move like a shadow where people kept their eyes busy. Colt felt the danger shift from theoretical to immediate. That claim, armed, skilled, desperate, images clicking into place of a man who did not tender threats but delivered them, who looked at a face like Nayland's and saw only merchandise. For a breath Colt's mind ran the standard ledger, avoid, right on. Let someone else settle what you did not cause. Preserve your height and your small, fragile plans for quiet living. But then his thoughts turned like a knife on its edge, short and sharp. I walked away before. I left a house to crumble rather than knock on a door. I counted coin while kin starved. I turned my horse's flank when cruelty had need of a witness, and those quick admissions stung worse than any bullet, sharpened into a reason to stay. Another flicker of thought. If I leave, who answers the songs the elders carry? Shaped itself into obligation. Nayland watched these small mental trials without hurry. knowing that a man's courage often arrives as a private argument inside his own skull, and Colt felt the canyon press its question against him. Will you be the man who cares, or will you be the man who keeps riding? He imagined the stranger's hands, rough, quick, and practiced at breaking ties between object and story. He imagined Naylor's face, patient and lined, and in the contrast something like a new moral compass clicked. Actions have weight beyond immediate consequence. They echo. They circle back like coyotes at night. Colt thought of the Mercer homestead and how silence had served as his cowardice there, and his heart, an old, knuckled thing that had learned to ride through storms, tightened into resolve. Still, fear whispered a practical counter. You could be outgunned, outmaneuvered, made a corpse for a trinket, and the world would not pause for your motives, and that thought was honest enough to be respected. The canyon's air held both warnings, and Colt let the two stand like two tracks in the dust until one felt truer than the other. He rose then, boots setting into the prints left by whoever had passed before, and as he did, Naylor placed a hand at his shoulder, not as restraint, but as covenant, quiet, solid, and Colt, who had ridden to forget, found instead a purpose forming like a small ember, to follow these tracks not for glory or bounty, but to answer a call that had nothing to do with him once and everything to do with the kind of man he wanted to be now. And with that choice the canyon seemed to settle, not into peace, but into readiness. The danger remained, sharp as a blade, but so did Colt's decided step. Naylor led Colt along a narrow ledge where the canyon's voice shifted from whisper to a low, ancestral hum. And as the elder paused before a slab of stone, time itself seemed to lean forward. Upon that rock, weathered by wind and years, was a carving. Warriors in profile, riders with feathers, settlers with tools, children with skipping ropes of sun. And at the center a symbol like a rising sun split down the middle, as if an old wound had been etched into the earth. Naylor's thumb traced the groove with reverence, and then, without hurry, he explained that the carving marked the cavern below where, generations ago, a sacred object had been placed to hold memory and blessing, carved of bone and cedar, wrapped in prayer, entrusted to keep peace between people and land, a thing whose meaning braided story, law, and comfort together. The elder spoke with the clarity of someone who had watched seasons change for decades, and he told of how balanced there had been until the object's absence began to show. Animals behaving oddly, fire refusing to burn clean, shared dreams that wound through families as warnings, small misfortunes that felt like the first tremor before a larger one, proof that some disturbances are not merely physical but moral in scope. Colt, whose life had been measured by horseflesh and hard bargains, felt an initial disbelief, yet the odd signs they had seen in the tracks in the dust softened his skepticism into careful dread, because whether or not one believed in spirits, the world gave its own testimony. Naylor then described plainly that someone had come before with purpose, no aimless drifter but a relic digger who hunted consecrated pieces to sell to collectors who prized history more than people, a man skilled in movement and indifference, hands used to taking what others guard with song and prayer. Hearing this, Colt's thoughts ran to the ledger of his life, the nights he'd avoided a fight, the promises he'd let rot like old wood, the mercies he'd withheld because doing so was easier. Naylor's next sentence was quiet but worked like a key. You listen before you shoot. Few men do. Those words sat in Colt's throat like a hard coin. They were not an accusation but a challenge to a different bravery, one not televised by quick draws but marked by restraint, listening, patience, and the willingness to accept that some victories are preserved by care rather than conquest. Colt considered the practical counsel too. Retreat, inform authorities, live to write another day. Yet another voice, older and less fearful, suggested this was the moment to stay, to answer a call that had nothing to do with law and everything to do with the rightness of things. Naylor, with no need to cloak urgency and drama, laid out the harm the wrong hands could do. The object could be twisted into a trophy that amplified division, sold piece by piece until a story was leached of its soul, or misused to justify violence. Colt felt the canyon press the stakes into him, and in the hush he heard not only the elder's words but the memory of his own failings like a chorus urging repair. So he listened, as instructed, letting the elder's history and the canyon's small protests shape his answer. And when he nodded, it was a slow, measured motion, the motion of a man who realized that being chosen was less an honor of pride and more a summons to protect. Together they turned toward the dark mouth of the cavern, carrying the fragile knowledge that what lay beneath stone could heal or hurt depending on the hands that met it and the hearts that held it. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. Dusk folded into the canyon like a slow hand closing a book, and as the light then Colt noticed how the shadows lengthened into shapes that seemed to listen. The distant hoofbeats came then, measured, deliberate, not the random clatter of wild horses but the economy of a man who rides with purpose, and the sound slid along the rock and into Colt's bones like a reminder of old, dangerous trades. Nayland did not startle. He merely tilted his head as if the canyon itself had whispered the rhythm to him, and Colt, who once would have answered with a quick draw and a plan already forming in his skull, found himself matching the elder's restraint, learning in the quiet the difficult lesson that patience can be a weapon too, soft, slow, and precise. Together they made a low fire in a hollow where the walls would swallow most of its light, and the flames threw the two figures into long shapes that pooled on the stone, nail and silhouettes daddy as a carven Colt's less sure, edges frayed by years on the run. Conversation was sparse, the kind of economy that carries more weight than a shout. Nayland spoke of the canyon and old verbs, of balance and listening, of how anxious ground speaks before men do, and Colt answered with the small, practical details of a life lived half in motion and half in regret, how he'd learned to ride a stubborn colt, how a ledger could ruin a name, how hometown could become a foreign country overnight. Yet when the elder asked him finally why he feared what he feared, Colt's answer came not as bravado but as something raw and honest. He feared not the bullet but the empty ledger of a life without a decent line in it, a fear of dying without having ever done something that would be remembered for its goodness rather than its avoidance. The confession trembled in the firelight like a moth beating its wings, and Nayland's response was no sermon but a deep, knowing silence that suggested he had heard the truth in many forms before. The night pressed around them with the kind of attention only solitude can bring at every small sound, the scuff of a boot, the distant call of a night bird, the shifting of a rock, felt amplified, like the canyon itself was holding its breath to see what they would choose. Colt thought of his hands, calloused from rains and work, and the small acts of kindness he'd offered in secret, leaving a coin at a window, fixing a neighbor's roof without asking for thanks, and he wondered if such things were enough to redeem decades of smaller sins. The hoofbeats grew nearer and then softened into a rhythm that circled, as if the stranger were taking stock rather than striking, and Colt felt the old muscle response of readiness, that familiar geometry of thread and reaction. But he found himself restraining that muscle, letting patience do the work instead. Nayland's presence was a steady ballast. The elder's calmness taught a different kind of courage, the courage not to be the first to strike but to be the first to hold back long enough to understand why violence might be the wrong answer. In the lull, Colt's mind wandered to faces he had failed, his father's tight mouth, his sister's disappointed silence, and the landscape of regret knitted itself into a new map where actions might repair what words had broken. The fire outlined their features into a story of contrasts, the old man who had learned to listen to the earth and the so-called outlaw learning to listen to his own conscience. The night held them like a judgmental but fair juror, and when the hoofbeats finally moved off to a ridge and away from the hollow near their camp, Colt did not exhale in relief so much as in careful acceptance. He had felt danger and chosen a harder path for it, that of understanding and protection rather than immediate retribution. Before sleep took him in the thin space between watchful thoughts, Colt whispered a promise to the land, not theatrical but steady. If the canyon had chosen him, then he would answer, not with grand gestures, but with the small, steady acts that build a life worth remembering. And as the embers dimmed, Nail and steady breathing in the canyon's low, watchful hum became a kind of benediction. Colt felt, for the first time in years, the possibility that a man could change the ledger of his life one careful choice at a time. At first light the canyon took on the thin, honest color of new day, and Colt, awake to the ridge, spotted a man at a camp where no respectful traveler would rest. The stranger moved with careful economy, checking a rifle, stacking gear, tending a low, private fire, and Colt felt a taut recognition like a splinter under skin. Briggs Teller, the name that traveled through saloons and trading posts with the caution of whispered trouble. Briggs's face held the kind of scars that read like accounts, a half-moon nick across a cheek, a pale line along his forearm, a smile practiced to bargain pain into profit, and Colt's memory slid back to a cattle drive where Briggs had broken a man over a missing calf and Colt had looked away then because survival had felt cheaper than interference, a cowardice that had nested into his bones and now returned with a corrosive clarity. Nayland stood patient as stone beside him, and when Colt motioned they moved closer under the canyon's hush so the morning could witness what words alone could not. Briggs handled his gear with the ease of a man who sold other people's stories for coin and stacked near his pack the wrappings and bone that marked relic work, and Colt's mind flicked to town rumors. Briggs's auctions were items taken from graves and encampments traded hands while sorrow went unpaid. When Briggs looked up his eyes measured everything like currency and he said Colt's name with a flat amusement, Colt Mercer. Small world. And the sound was a ledger closing. Colt felt the old guilt like a hot coal and chose a steadier response than explanation, saying simply, "I'm here because some things aren't for sale." And Briggs answered with a dry laugh like stones grinding and shrugged, "Respect costs, Mercer. I make sure buyers pay." His tone turning pity into a commodity while sharpening the canyon's air. Colt cataloged immediate danger. Briggs had rifles, contacts in town, and ability to vanish into markets where law and conscience bent with coin. But a deeper ledger pressed harder, the memory of having looked away, the balance owed for past inaction, and that debt pushed Colt toward a choice that had less to do with fame and more to do with who he could be when the dust settled. Nayland stepped forward then and spoke as if the canyon led him words. "This place keeps its stories. It asks to be left as given," and the sentence carried no pleading, only the plain truth of weather, which tightened Briggs's face into contempt because his trade profited by turning story into trophy. Colt met Briggs's stare with a steadiness that surprised him because it came from a resolve kindling since Nayland had said the land had chosen him, and the moral line before him felt sharp and immediate. Ride away and preserve skin and habit, or stand and answer a call asking for repair instead of retreat. Briggs shifted, weighing whether Colt was leverage or liability, and in the calculation Colt saw the chance to close one ledger of shame and begin another of purpose. Briggs reached for a wrapped bundle and the sight of his hands on bones tightened something in Colt like a vice. The relic's presence made the canyon feel urgent, and Colt remembered Nayland's hand on his shoulder and felt the elder's quiet trust settle into him like an unfamiliar armor. He breathed the dry air and, with surprising clarity, chose the harder path, to confront and to protect, knowing the test ahead would not be a spectacle of quick draws but a quiet series of choices whose echoes would outlast the morning sun. Nayland led Colt to a narrow fissure where the canyon's breath thinned and the wind ran through the crack like an old, low zone. And when the elder laid his palm against the stone the hum answered as if the earth itself remembered names and debts. Nayland spoke with the calm of someone who had listened to seasons rather than speeches, and he described the land not as property but as kin, root and river, bone and story braided together. And he told Colt that harmony here was delicate, kept by countless small acts of care and by the discipline of restraint. And when that balance phrased the canyon whispers in ways a man can learn to hear if he'll only slow down. The jackrabbits run blind in the dusk, a hawk circles too near the ground, a spring changes the tone of its burble. Fires will smoke and smolder and refuse clean flame, and households 3 draws away share the same bad dream. Colt listened with a practical man's ear, at first trying to translate Nayland's language into ledger terms, symptom, cause, remedy. But the elder's descriptions were not puzzles to be solved by ledger entries or by the hard arithmetic of force. They were moral weather, and Nayland explained that the secret object in the cavern carried not magic in a showman's sense but moral weight, a responsibility folded into carved cedar and bone that held a people's memory. And when such a thing is dislodged the land answers with a subtle discontent that multiplies into harm if left unchecked. Colt felt a resistance rise in him. He was a man trained to meet threats with a gun and quick feet, to measure worth by cattle and courts, not by whirlwinds of feeling. But the canyon's hum made something else possible, a softening of the reflex to solve a problem by breaking it. And Nayland's manner modeled a different courage, the patience to wait and listen until the right action revealed itself. As the elder spoke he pointed to small details with quiet precision, lichen torn in a way that suggested careless hands, a scrape on a rock that read like the hurried passage of a pack, the scent of old smoke like a promise burned in a hurry, and these trivialities stitched together into a larger picture, the presence of a relic daker who did not simply pass but excavated histories for sale, a man who saw stories as commerce rather than communion. Colt felt the old ledger of his life press against him, the nights he'd chosen flight over confrontation, the neighbor he'd not helped because it was easier to look away, and those memories sharpened into a new kind of accounting. Perhaps being chosen by the canyon was less an honor than a summons to repair the accounts one had let run ransack, a demand for small acts of courage that add up into a redeemed life. Nalen's voice held no triumph when he described danger, only a steady insistence that listening is a form of action and that few men practiced it, which landed in Colt like a key turning in a lock. He pictured the cavern's mouth beyond the fissure and felt the hush of something watching, an audience not of people but of places that remember wrongs done to them, and he imagined how a man's quick draw could seal a wound instead of heal it. This thought shifted him. Battles aren't always fought with gunpowder. Sometimes they require restraint, witness, and the careful mending of what's been torn. Under the canyon's patient sky, Colt felt a slow burn of resolve turning in him. A change that was less dramatic than incremental but steadier. He would learn to listen before he acted, to hold back his hand long enough to hear the land's testimony, and in that long pause he might find a path toward making one decent thing of his life, one act of service that could outlast a body and outlive a habit of looking away. Nalen's presence was the quiet proof that this kind of courage existed. And when Colt finally exhaled, it was not the relief of retreat but the settling of a man who recognized that true bravery could be as small as patience and as large as the vow to protect what others would see as mere stone and story. Briggs caught them at the creek just as the water thinned into a silver ribbon over stone, stepping out from behind a cottonwood with a rifle held low but steady, the kind of posture that said he'd already weighed the cost of killing and found it cheap. The morning light flashed along the barrel as he called out, "Trail ends here, Mercer," his voice dry as August grass, and Colt felt the old instinct surge, the urge to reach for iron, to move first, to survive by force, but he strangled it down, choosing instead to mirror Nalen's calm as the elder stood like withered granite beside him. Briggs came closer, boots grinding on gravel, and with a wolfish grin he said, "You riding patrol for the old man now? Since when does Colt Mercer take orders from anyone who doesn't carry a badge or a bankroll?" The taunt sharpened to reopen old wounds, but Colt held firm, answering only with a quiet, steady, "I'm standing where I should have stood a long time ago," and the simplicity of the truth seemed to irritate Briggs more than a threat would have. The relic hunter turned his gaze to Nalen then, eyes narrowing with the cold hunger of a man who evaluated everything by its selling price, and he spat, "I'm getting into that cavern. You two can step aside or get buried in the same dirt." The words flat, transactional, as if violence were just another trade. Colt angled his body toward the elder, making his loyalty clear without flourish, and Briggs laughed, a short, cutting sound. "Look at you, Mercer, playing guardian now. You weren't so noble back on the Chisholm when things got ugly." The reminder landing like a stone because Colt remembered that cattle drove well, remembered looking away from Briggs's cruelty, remembered choosing his own skin over someone else's pain. But instead of flinching, he let the guilt settle and shape his resolve, replying, "I'm not that man anymore," in a voice low and even, and Nalen's presence beside him felt like a quiet confirmation that such change was possible. Briggs's smile vanished, replaced by calculation, and he lifted his rifle just enough to paint the threat clear. "You think you can stop me with words?" he said, and without waiting for an answer he squeezed the trigger and sent a bullet into the dust at Colt's feet, the shot cracking through the canyon like a whip, dust exploding upward in a violent plume that stung Colt's shins and made the creek shudder in its bed. Nalen did not move, which unsettled Briggs more visibly than the refusal to flinch, and the relic hunter barked, "Next one's not a warning," a promise so cold it might have frozen the shallow water around his boots. Colt felt the echo of fear he'd carried for years. Fear of conflict, fear of death, fear of becoming the man who solved everything with violence. But the canyon's lessons, Nalen's steady teaching, and the weight of his own unfinished redemption braided together into something sturdier than fear. And he met Briggs's stare without hesitation. Minimalist words carried all the tension needed. "You're not crossing that creek," Colt said, and though his voice was quiet, It carried the finality of a door closing, not slammed but shut with purpose. Briggs stepped forward anyway, rage beginning to crack his composure, but Colt held his ground, and the refusal itself was an unexpected barrier, one the relic hunter wasn't prepared for. Colt didn't threaten, didn't posture, didn't reach for the gun he wore. He simply stood, a man choosing the harder path he'd avoided his whole life, and that certainty unsettled Briggs in a way bullets never could. The canyon around them seemed to tighten, the air thinning with the possibility of sudden violence, and Colt felt the moment stretch like a drawn bowstring, knowing that whatever happened next would define not just the conflict but the man he was becoming. And as Briggs's finger twitched near the trigger, the creek whispered its steady, warning voice, leaving the entire world poised on the knife edge of the next breath. The cavern opened before Colt like a great stone throat, cool breath rolling out on a slow exhale that carried the scent of earth older than memory, and as he stepped inside with Nayland beside him, his boots sank into dust so fine it felt like the remnants of stories ground down over centuries. The darkness shifted not his emptiness but his presence, and when Nayland lit a small embered torch, the flame revealed paintings along the walls, figures locked in dances of unity and loss, warriors offering water to settlers, children clasping hands beneath the sun-drawn hole, and then the same sun split in two, an image that echoed the carving outside and made Colt's ribs tighten as if the symbol had reached into him. Flickers of firelight moved across these ancient marks like living memory, and the canyon's hum, so familiar above, deepened into a heartbeat here, as if the stone itself pulsed with quiet endurance. Colt reached out but stopped short of touching the paintings, understanding instinctively that reverence mattered more than curiosity, and Nayland nodded at that restraint with a small, approving breath. The elder spoke in low, rhythmic tones about the people who had made this place sacred, their sacrifices during winters when food ran thin, their rituals of gratitude when the rains returned, their refusal to turn their backs even when hardship should at their heels, and the emotional weight of those stories settled on Colt like a mantle, not burdensome but grounding, as if the cavern considered him and found him capable of carrying a small part of its history deeper in. The ceiling dipped low, and Colt felt the brush of cold stone above his hat brim, a sensation like the land leaning close to whisper, and he realized with a slow, steady burn of humility that this place was no mere hiding spot for relics but a living archive, one that breathed through silence and remembered through echo. The torch's flame licked the walls, revealing more symbols, spirals representing journey, hands representing ancestry, a circle drawn around both warriors and healers to show that survival depended on all, not on the strength of a single roll. And Colt felt a tug in his chest, a recognition that the ledger of his life had been missing something essential, connection to something larger than his mistakes, larger than his drifting years. Nayland's voice blended with the cavern's hum as he explained how the sacred object, cradled deeper within, was meant to hold balance, not power, meant to preserve unity rather than elevate greed. And Colt understood then why its theft tore at the land like a wound. The cavern's air thickened with meaning, and Colt sensed, not through mysticism but through the sheer gravity of place, that Nayland had not chosen him for skill or strength but for willingness to listen, to change, to carry a responsibility that did not promise reward. He thought of the years he had run from accountability, the faces he had let fade rather than face them, and the cavern seemed to breathe around him, patient, watchful, allowing him to stand in the truth of who he had been and who he was becoming. The ground beneath him vibrated faintly, almost like a voice clearing its throat, and Colt felt a thread of connection on spool inside him, tying him not just to Nayland but to everyone who had ever stepped into this chamber seeking guidance, reconciliation, or courage. He swallowed hard, overwhelmed by the intimacy of a place that seemed to know him without judgment, and the flickering torchlight made the painted figures appear to move, not in magic but in metaphor, their shadows stretching across Colt's boots as if inviting him into their long continuum of survival and duty. He realized with a clarity sharp as flint that protecting the cavern was not about stopping Briggs or winning a confrontation. It was about honoring a trust handed down through generations, a trust Nayland now placed in him. And as they reached the cavern's heart, where the secret object once rested, Colt felt the silence settle into him like a vow, a breath shared between man and earth, promising that whatever came next he would stand in defense of this place that had, against all odds, begun to believe in him. While we catch our breath by this dusty road, go on and tip your hat to the last rodeo. Give this story a like and subscribe so you can ride with us again soon. All right then, let's get back on the trail. Briggs burst into the cavern with the fury of a man who believed the world owed him its secrets, his boots scraping harshly against sacred stone as the echo of his intrusion shattered the fragile hush Colt and Nayland had been standing in. Before Colt could fully turn, Briggs swung the butt of his rifle and struck Nayland across the shoulder, sending the elder collapsing against the cavern wall with a pained exhale that sounded far too thin for a man who had carried centuries of story in his bones. And something in Colt snapped, not into reckless rage, but into a cold, decisive clarity born from every lesson the canyon had pressed into him. The torchlight flickered violently as Briggs leveled his rifle at Colt, his grin a jagged thing in the half-dark, and he sneered, "All this over a trinket carved by old ghosts? You really let the stories get to you, Mercer," the mockery dripping with dismissal. But Colt didn't move for his gun, didn't lunge, didn't speak immediately. He simply stepped between Briggs and Nayland, his silence heavy as iron, and that restrained, unsettled Briggs more than any threat might have. When Colt finally spoke, his voice was low and steady. "These aren't stories for selling, Briggs. They're the memory of a people who survived more than you'll ever understand." And Briggs laughed, harsh and tinny. "Bear me the sermon. You're no guardian, Mercer. You're a drifter who finally found a new mistake to die for." The words meant to shake Colt back into the man he used to be, the man who had looked away during that cattle drive. But instead the insult only rooted Colt deeper, his stance widening, his breath evening, his purpose sharpening into something clean and immovable. Nayland's groan from behind him burned through Colt like a brand, and he felt the weight of the elder's trust settle between his shoulder blades as he stepped forward, forcing Briggs a half step back, not through force, but through the quiet authority of conviction. The cavern seemed to tense with them, its ancient paintings flickering in the torchlight like a crowd of witnesses holding their breath. And Briggs, rattled by Colt's composure, spat, "You think you know what this place means? You think any of it matters once the right buyer comes along?" But Colt shook his head slowly. "It matters because it's bigger than us, bigger than profit, bigger than fear. And I won't let you tear apart what isn't yours." The words striking the air with an unexpected sharpness that halted Briggs for the briefest moment. The relic hunter's eyes narrowed, recalculating, and he shifted his grip on the rifle, the metal glinting with lethal promise as he growled, "You're standing in my way, Mercer." And Colt answered, "For once in my life, I'm standing exactly where I should." The sentence carrying the weight of every regret he'd ever carried and every vow he'd silently made since stepping into this canyon. Briggs lifted the rifle just an inch higher, enough to threaten, enough to promise blood, but Colt didn't flinch, and the refusal to fear fractured Briggs's confidence like a hairline crack in glass. The cavern held the tension like a drawn bowstring, and instead of reaching for his holster, Colt lifted his hands slightly. Not surrender, not weakness, but a slow, deliberate movement that forced Briggs to track him with careful aim, buying precious breaths for Nayland to shift behind him. And Colt said, "If you walk out with that relic, you'll break more than a tradition. You'll break the balance of a land that's been here longer than your name." And somehow, in the stillness that followed, the words hit harder than any bullet. Briggs, furious at the tremor Colt's calm had sparked inside him, tightened his finger on the trigger. But the canyon itself felt as if it leaned closer, wind funneling through the fissure in a low warning hum. And Colt stepped fully into Briggs's line of fire, choosing, finally, to act not out of fear but out of a duty he had once run from. In that charged instant, the battle became not a spectacle of violence but a collision of choices, and Colt's stance, unflinching, resolute, unarmed yet unyielding, cut through Briggs's bravado like a blade, marking the first moment Briggs realized he might be facing a man who had outgrown every weakness he once exploited. Colt stood over Briggs with his revolver drawn, the barrel reflecting the trembling torchlight, and for a long, breathless moment the cavern felt too small to hold the weight of what waited in the air between them. Briggs froze, eyes wide but not with fear, more with a gambler's calculation, as if he were already scanning for the next advantage, the next cruelty he could twist into survival. But Colt's hand did not tighten on the trigger, even though instinct, habit, and years of running from men like Briggs all urged him to finish it here and now. the cavern walls pulsed with the echo of Colt's heartbeat, the sacred paintings flickering like a silent jury, each symbol, unity, sacrifice, balance, staring back at him with a plea to do more than repeat the violence that had scarred this land for generations. Nayland, still injured, leaned against the stone and called out with a voice worn but steady, "Colt, choose honor, not anger." The words cracking through the tension like a slow-moving beam of light. And something inside Colt, something raw, wounded, and longing for redemption, answered that call before his mind caught up. He looked at Briggs, truly looked, and saw not just the threat but the mirror of what he might have become had he kept taking the easier roads. A man hollowed by greed, a man who believed the world was only worth what it could be sold for, a man who thought nothing sacred. Colt's revolver wavered, the weight of it suddenly immense, and he felt the canyon watching, holding its breath to see what choice he would carve into the memory of this place. He breathed out, slow as dawn breaking over the plains, and lowered the gun, letting the echo of restraint ring louder than any shot could have, saying softly, "I won't stain this place with your blood." And the decision felt like shedding old skin, like stepping into the man he had been trying to become since the moment he chose to listen instead of draw. Briggs, enraged by mercy he mistook his weakness, lunged forward in a reckless burst, knife pulled from his boot, his voice a feral snarl as he shouted, "That was your last mistake, Mercer." And Colt braced himself, feet planting into sacred dirt, ready to fight without killing, ready to protect Nayland even at the cost of his own life. But before Briggs reached him, the cavern let out a deep, resonant crack, like a mountain groaning in its sleep, and a cluster of stones above Briggs broke loose, tumbling with sudden violence. The Rallic hunter dodged the first, but the second struck his shoulder, spinning him, and then a larger slab dropped at an angle, pinning his leg beneath it with crushing finality but sparing his life, an intervention so swift and precise it felt less like coincidence and more like the land itself had made its judgment. Briggs screamed, fury collapsing into raw pain, his knife skittering harmlessly across the cavern floor, and Colt stared at the fallen rocks with a mixture of awe and dread, understanding in his bones that justice here did not need his gun. Nayland exhaled a trembling breath, relief washing over his features as he whispered, "The land protects what remembers it." And Colt, shaken to his core, holstered his revolver with a reverence he had never given a weapon before. He knelt beside the pinned man, not gloating, not cruel, and said, "You're done, Briggs." The canyon decided, the words carrying neither triumph nor bitterness, only truth. Briggs glared at him with the last shreds of wounded pride, but even he could not deny the finality in the stone's grip. Colt rose slowly, feeling the cavern's heartbeat settle into a calm thrum, as if approving the path he had chosen, and in that sacred quiet he understood with absolute clarity that mercy, not violence, had rewritten the ledger of his life, giving him a second chance no bullet ever could. Nayland sat propped against the cavern wall, breath thin but steady, the torchlight brushing his face with a trembling glow that made every line of ache and endurance seem carved there by the land itself. And Colt knelt beside him, hands hovering, uncertain, reverent, as if afraid that even a touch might disturb the sacred quiet settling around them. The elder's eyes, dimmed by pain yet sharpened by gratitude, lifted to Colt with a weight that made the younger man's chest tighten, and in a voice rough as river stone Nayland murmured, "You listened. Not with fear, not with anger, but with your heart." The words trembling in the air like a blessing spoken only one truly earned. Colt bowed his head, the transformation inside him unfolding slow and steady, like sunrise inching across the range after a long night. And he felt, not imagined, but felt, the canyon's breath at his back, the subtle shift of air that seemed to acknowledge the choice he had made. He looked to the alcove where the sacred object had once rested, its absence still humming like a missing note in a song. Yet something in the stillness told him its purpose lived on untarnished, preserved by their defense, by Nayland's resilience, by Colt's refusal to stain this place with blood, and the knowledge settled into him with the weight of a vow he hadn't spoken aloud but knew he carried now in every breath. Nayland watched him with a soft pride, the kind of father might offer a son who had finally understood the meaning of responsibility. And he said, "Many men come here wanting to dig. Few come ready to protect," each syllable slow, deliberate, a recognition rather than praise. And Colt felt those words settle deeper than any compliment he had ever received. reaching into the hollow places he had long tried to ride away from. He thought of the ledger of his life, the broken promises, the nights spent drifting, the way he had once looked away from Briggs's cruelty, and realized that while those memories would never vanish, they no longer defined him. The cavern, the canyon, Nayland's trust had reshaped him into something sturdier, something truer, a man not perfect but anchored to a cause older than his regrets. The fire crackled softly, sending shadows dancing across the ancient paintings, and Colt swore the figures, warriors, children, the split sun, seemed to tilt toward him, not in illusion or superstition but in the poetically memory response to reverence. Nayland reached out with a trembling hand, placing his palm over Colt's and pressing gently, a gesture both fragile and menacing, and he whispered, "The canyon respects you now." The statement simple but monumental, a truth that swept through Colt with the force of a river breaking through drought-hardened banks. Respect, something he had never chased, never expected, certainly never imagined earning from a land that had seen centuries pass like shifting sand, felt more valuable than any coin a man could carry, and he understood in that moment why Nayland had trusted him, why the canyon had not rejected him even when danger approached. He had chosen restraint over rage, protection over pride, listening over dominance, and those choices had carved a new path in him. Colt lifted his gaze to the cavern walls, deeply aware that every color and line held the memory of people who had survived storms he could barely imagine, and he felt humbled, grounded, reshaped. The quiet that surrounded them was no longer tense but peaceful, the kind of calm that comes only after something sacred has been safeguarded. And Colt breathed it in like a man starved for meaning. Nayland's voice, faint but steady, came again. "Go forward carrying this place in you, not as burden, but as compass." And Colt felt the words lodge in him like a guiding star, something he could follow long after the canyon fell silent. He placed a hand over his chest, feeling the steady thrum of a man changed from the inside out, and whispered back, "I'll carry it with honor." The promise soft but unwavering, and as the torch's glow dimmed in the cavern's breath wrapped around them like a quiet acknowledgement, Colt knew with absolute certainty that no gold, no land deed, no badge could ever match the worth of what he had gained: the canyon's respect, Nayland's trust, and a purpose that would outlast the dust of his old mistakes. The rising sun crept over the canyon rim in slow, tender strokes, spilling gold across the stone until the whole world looked washed in forgiveness. And Colt stood beside Nayland at the mouth of the cavern, feeling the warmth on his face like a quiet blessing. The elder's breathing was steadier now, though still fragile, and when he reached into the folds of his woven pouch, Colt felt a hush fall over the morning as if even the wind paused to witness what came next. Nayland withdrew a small token carved from cedar, simple, smooth, shaped by hands that valued meaning over ornament, and the grain of the wood glowed softly in the dawn light, carrying the faint scent of smoke, sap, and something older, something that felt like memory passed through generations. He placed it in Colt's palm with a slow, deliberate movement, and the weight of it, light yet impossibly heavy, settled into Colt as if the object recognized him. Nayland murmured, "This is trust, not given lightly," his voice worn but certain, and Colt closed his fingers around the token with a reverence he didn't know he could feel, understanding that this was not a gift but an acknowledgement, a bridge between two worlds that had every reason to keep their distance. The cedar token bore a small carving of the split sun, yet unlike the one on the canyon wall, its halves curved toward each other instead of away, a quiet symbol of healing rather than division. And Colt felt a swell of emotion rise in his chest, not loud or dramatic, but deep, steady, and humbling, as if someone had turned a lantern toward the forgotten corners of his spirit. He looked at Nayland, the elder's eyes shining with the wisdom of someone who had weathered storms of both land and soul. And Colt said, voice low but certain, "I'll protect this place, its stories, its memory. I'll honor what you've trusted me with." And he felt the truth of that vow anchor itself in him like a root-seeking soil. Nayland nodded slowly, approval etched into every line on his face, and replied, "Protecting is not fighting. It is listening, watching, tending what others overlooked." And Colt took those words in like water, knowing they would guide every step he took beyond this moment. The farewell that followed was not filled with grand words or long embraces. Neither man needed spectacle, but instead unfolded in a quiet, profound stillness, built on shared respect turned through danger, honesty, and the sacred decision to choose restraint over destruction. Colt helped nail into his feet, their hands clasping briefly, not as elder and intruder, not as teacher and student, but as two men who had stood at the edge of something larger than themselves and chosen to protect it rather than exploit it. When Colt finally turned toward his horse, the canyon greeted him with a soft breeze carrying the scent of juniper and dust, a breath that seemed to acknowledge him not as a trespasser but as someone the land could trust to walk gently. The cedar token rested against his chest, its warmth pulsing like a small second heartbeat, and Colt understood that this was no badge, no title, no debt. It was a responsibility, offered willingly, carried proudly. As he mounted up, he glanced back toward Nayland, who watched him with serene assurance, the elder's silhouette framed by the ancient stones he had spent a lifetime protecting. And Colt felt the pieces of his past, the regrets, the mistakes, the years spent drifting, settle into a shape that finally made sense, not erased but repurposed into something steadier, wiser. With a final nod, quiet but heavy with meaning, Colt turned his horse toward the open trail, and as the sun lifted higher, casting long shadows that pointed toward the future, he rode out not as a wanderer searching for escape but as a guardian of a truth he had never sought yet now bore with honor, a man carrying the canyon's respect in his pocket and its blessing in his bones. Colt rode out beneath a sky washed clean by dawn, the horizon stretching wide like a promise he no longer feared to face, and the cedar token Nayland had given him rested warm against his chest, rising and falling with each breath as if it were a second heartbeat guiding him toward a life he'd long believed beyond his reach. The canyon receded behind him, its cliffs catching the early sun in quiet farewell, but its presence lingered in him like a steady hand at his spine, a compass formed not of metal but of memory, carrying every hum of wind, every flicker of torchlight, every whispered lesson carved into stone. With each hoofbeat, Colt felt something inside him settle, not into complacency but into purpose, a slow earned knowing that the man he had been, restless, guilt-heavy, always drifting from the edges of his own mistakes, had become the soil for the man he was choosing to be now. The trail toward the frontier town stretched ahead, familiar yet transformed, and Colt understood that riding back did not mean returning to old patterns but confronting them. The neighbor he'd failed to help, the sister whose letters he'd never answered, the memory of a father who'd taught him strength but not gentleness. These ghosts no longer haunted him. They beckoned him toward mending, toward courage of a quieter, steadier kind. He imagined himself stepping onto his family's old porch, standing beneath the cracked lintel where promises had once been made and broken, and instead of shrinking from the memory, he felt a resolve settle over him like a well-fitted coat, because now his mission was not escape but repair, not survival but service. Nayland's words echoed in him. Protecting is not fighting, it is listening, watching, tending, and Colt repeated them softly to the wind as he rode, letting them braid into his spirit like guiding threads. The land around him shifted from canyon stone to open plains, tall grasses bending in the breeze, their soft whisper reminding him of the cavern hum, and he found himself listening for the subtle messages nature carried, the pattern of birds lifting in unison, the way the sun warmed one side of his face as if urging him forward, the rhythm of his horse's gait syncing with his heartbeat until man and animal moved with one intention. He thought back to the moment when Nayland had first warned him, "Cowboy, you're on sacred land," and how he had answered, "I meant no harm," not realizing then how hollow the words were when unbacked by action. But now, as he followed the rising trail, Colt felt the truth of a new vow forming beneath his ribs. He meant to do good, not in grand gestures but in steady choices, in the quiet bravery of showing up where he once walked away, in the patience to mend rather than outrun. The mystery he had stepped into, the danger he had faced, the wisdom he had absorbed from Nayland, all of it shaped his stride, tightening the slack in his moral spine and sharpening his sense of what mattered. He knew the frontier towns would test him, that skepticism would greet his attempts to repair old wrongs, that forgiveness, if granted, would come slowly. But he welcomed the challenge as a man welcomes rain after drought, knowing it was necessary, cleansing, right. As the sun climbed higher, Colt slowed his horse and looked back one last time toward the distant canyon, seeing not stone and shadow but the turning point of his life, the place where he had shed the version of himself shaped by regret and stepped into one forged by honor, humility, and earned respect. He touched the cedar token lightly, murmuring a thank you to Nayland, to the land, to the lessons whispered in dust and darkness. And then he turned forward again, guiding his horse toward a future he was no longer afraid to claim. And in that steady, determined quiet, Colt Mercer rode toward redemption, not as a man fleeing harm but as one who finally, fully intended to do good. If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.